All right, so we're going to start talking about the Audient right now. And before we even start talking about the Audient, we need to talk a little bit about signal flow. And we need to start with the input path and the monitor path. The input path and the monitor path is basically demonstrating our recording and how we listen to things as we are recording. So with every console, even if you don't realize it, there's two pathways for your audio. There's your recording path, which is right over here. So you can see here, I've got a little person who's singing. That's our source. They're singing la 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 la. That's the source. The audio starts with their vocal cords, goes out of their mouth, travels through the air into the microphone. And the microphone has a cable that's connected up somehow to the back of a mixing console. And there might be a preamp in there. There might be some extra little steps along the way. But basically, it is connected into a mixing console. And the mixing console then goes into our recorder. And this is the input path. This part over here into the recorder, it's the input path. And when we say input, we mean input into the recording. Okay, so that's what we're recording. The input path is the recording part. And then we've got the part that we can hear, which is our monitor path. That's what we listen to. So after the recorder, we come back into another console, and then we go to our speakers, and that's what we're actually listening to. So over here we've got our recording path, which is the part that goes into the recorder, which can be a tape machine or it can be a computer. And then after that, we come out of the tape machine or the computer into another mixing console and the speakers, and that's our monitor path. So up here, it says it right up here. The input path feeds the signal into the recorder, and the monitor path is what we listen to make sure there are no problems with the recorder. So the whole reason why we listen to a monitor path is because we want to make sure there's no problems with the recorder right here. So if we listen to speakers connected up to this mixing console right here, which is completely possible, then the speakers would be coming before the recorder. So if there's some kind of a problem with the cables right here, then you wouldn't know it until after you go to listen to the playback. And that's going to be a problem, because if we're only dealing with one person, one musician, it's not that big of a deal. But if we're doing a whole orchestra with like 50 people or 100 people and we're recording a lot of different microphones, we need to make sure that we don't have to do that a bunch of times. We only, it's bad enough to have to do it more than once, but you really want to be listening to your recording after the recording device. So that way you can hear every step of the way how everything is sounding. So that's a really important thing to pay attention to. Now, these mixing consoles here, I've got two of them in the diagram, but there's a little arrow connecting the two of them together, and it says combined into one unit. And essentially what that means is that these two mixing consoles here are always combined into one unit these days. And so this is what we have, a split channel console or an inline console. And we're going to talk about the differences between those right now. So one more time, the input path is the path from the source to the recorder. In this case, in the picture, the source is a person singing and the recorder is a computer. The monitor path is the path from the recorder to the speakers, and this is what we listen to. It's really important that you just keep that in mind. We always listen on the monitor path. So what you've talked about so far in Module 1 with the Mackie console is a split channel console. This is where the input path and monitor path are on two separate channels. So for example, if we look at my little diagram down here, if I have a vocal, guitar, bass, and a kazoo, because every good rock band needs a kazoo, that would be four microphones that I'm recording with. And remember, microphones are always mono. Very rarely do we record stereo. So vocal, guitar, bass, and kazoo are all one microphone. So that's four channels here. So channels 1 through 4 would be our input path. And then what happens is on each channel on the input path, there's usually some way to send that channel to the recording console. To the recording device. Some consoles have a direct out, which is really handy, And other consoles have some kind of a busing system where you have to run to some buses and then it goes out from there to your recorder. Every console is a little bit different in how it works, and you just have to understand from reading the manual or talking to somebody about it. So here we have channels 1 through 4 are our input path, and those channels would go from the console to the recording device. And the recording device would come back to the console on channels 5, 6, 7, and 8. And this is our monitor path. So what happens is we would have these set up so we're not actually hearing them. They're going straight into the console without us listening to them. And when we come back from straight into the recording device without us listening to them. And when we come back to the console from the recording device, we listen on these channels 5, 6, 7, and 8. So through our speakers, we are not hearing 1, 2, 3, and 4. We are only listening to 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we would have these muted somehow, or the level just wouldn't be feeding out to our speakers. There's usually a mix button on these consoles, and the mix button is what sends it to the control room mix, the left-right mix that we listen to. That's usually a button that sends it to that signal, so that's what we would do. So in these here, we would not have the mix button pressed. On these here, we would have the mix button pressed, and that mix button enables us to listen to it in the control room. So that's what's going on here, and what do I have written over here on the side? It says that most consumer boards fall into this category. So Mackie, Yamaha, like the lower priced ones, you don't start getting inline consoles until you get up to around the $5,000 range, and even then, not always. So most consoles up until about $5,000 and even beyond that, but really $5,000 you might start to see a few inline consoles at $5,000, but realistically up until around $5,000 it's all going to be split channel consoles. And down here I've got a little note here. When recording, you only listen to these channels here, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So you would not be actually listening to channels 1 through 4. They would just kind of be, they would be feeding into the recorder. So an inline console is different from a split channel console in that the input path and the monitor path are on the same channel. So here we have, you can see here's a little diagram of a split channel console, and you can see, inline console, and you can see that the monitor path has a row of faders across the bottom, and this is exactly what they look like, and the input path has a row of faders across the top. So you've actually got fader here and a fader here, and that's why it's called inline, because you actually have two pathways. The input path and the monitor path are in line with each other. They're right on top of each other. So that's why it's called an inline console, and they look like this. So here we can have more channels in a smaller space. So we have 1 through 8, and that's going to be our vocals, guitar, bass, and kazoo, and also some drums, bass drum, snare drum, overhead left, overhead right over here. And everything goes onto the same channel. So the vocal, the input path is on channel 1, and the monitor path is also on channel 1. And the guitar, the input path is on channel 1, and the monitor path is also on channel 2 and channel 2. So on and so forth, channel 3, channel 4, channel 5, 6, 7, and 8. Everything is right here on these same channels. We don't say channel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, although technically this is 16 inputs now. So we have 16 inputs happening here, and that's how we can listen to it and monitor it on the same channel. So on this one here, if we look at the colors, the input path is blue and the monitor path is green, and on these here, the green one is what we're listening to at all times. So when recording, you only listen to the monitor path here, which is the green one here. The whole point of having an inline console is to save space. That's really it. There's no special purpose behind an inline console except for just to make a smaller footprint. So inline consoles are a little bit deeper, but they don't have to be as wide. Because if I have, let's say I have 4 channels and I want to record and monitor on those 4 channels, if I'm making a console that's a split channel console, that console becomes this long. But if it's an inline console, it stays this long. I'm not taking up extra space in my room. I can have a narrower room. And that's really the whole point of an inline console. They are deeper, but usually that's okay. They're not usually twice as deep. They're usually just a little bit deeper. Okay, so that's really the whole point of an inline console, is just to save space. So the inline consoles usually have more inputs than a split channel console. So most inline consoles stop at 16 or 24 channels, and you do have some that are 32 channels. And 32 channels is pretty wide. It is a big machine. The Audient at SAE is 24 channels, but then we also have 8 buses, and we've got a whole patch bay and the master section, everything like that. So it takes up the whole room, but it's 24 channels in line. So it's actually 48 inputs on the back of that thing. So pretty, there's a lot going on, which is pretty cool. All right, before we keep going here, what's up? Ricky, how you doing, man? Before we keep going here, we are going to talk about some recording equipment terminology that we're going to be dealing with this week. And hopefully you already went through the notes and you did the quiz that was that's due before we start class today. And if you did do that, you would have seen some of this stuff, and some of these things will be feel like a little bit of a review. And the reason why is because that's all in the stuff you're supposed to look at over the weekend. You should have already been looking at these notes before we got to class today. Hopefully you've done that. Also, some of the stuff is probably a bit of a review from Module 1 with Kia. Probably went over some of the stuff with you before. So first off, we've got the Multitrack Recorder, and that's shortened to MTR, Multitrack Recorder MTR. And this is a generic term for all devices that can record multiple tracks at the same time. So a multitrack recorder could be a DAW, it could be a ADAT tape, or it could be a multitrack tape machine. So MTR, multitrack recorder, could be your computer, it could be a digital audio tape, ADAT, or it could be an old school tape machine. These days, you're going to find less and less tape machines out there. There are still, they're around, but they're hard to upkeep. It's expensive to upkeep. If they break, they're hard to fix. And then also tape is expensive. So you're not going to see that many multi-track tape machines around in the world. We do have one at SAE in New York. I think we still have it, actually. I'm not 100% sure that we still have it, but I'm pretty sure we do. But we don't really use it that much. And I know we have a 2-track tape machine that we do use for mastering and some, just to show you how to use it. But tape, there's only one company that makes tape anymore, so it's hard to find tape. And when I say one company that makes tape, I mean like in the world. There's not a market for it anymore. Everything is done on computers, and you'll hear people say that tape machines sound better than computers, and it's true, they do, but now with technology, plugins and stuff like that, you can make a computer sound just as good as a tape machine. And to be honest, if you listen to any modern music, then you're listening to computers. I mean, that's really, everything's made on computers these days, and it sounds fine. A lot of effort has been put into making computers sound good, and they sound great. So the whole idea of tape machines sound better than computers, it's valid-ish, but it's not something that you really need to worry about too much. I wouldn't really stress it. So, all right, then we have, so first of all, in our multi-track recorders, we've got our DAW, which stands for Digital Audio Workstation. Again, this should be a review. You probably learned this in Mod 1. A digital audio workstation is Pro Tools, Logic, Ableton Live, FL Studio, any of those. Anything that can basically record MIDI data and instruments, and you can play stuff with it, and also can record audio and allows you to move the audio around and do stuff to it. This is called non-destructive editing, and this is what the main purpose of a DAW is. Pro Tools, Logic, Live, they're all very similar in how they work-ish. Live is the odd one out there, and then FL Studio, I think, is mostly for making beats, but I'm pretty sure you can also record your voice and stuff into FL Studio. Remember, a DAW needs a computer and an audio interface, not just a computer, not just an audio interface. It needs both. So the whole kind of everything that you need for a DAW is not just the computer. Although computers do have headphone jacks plugged into them, and they also have microphone jacks in them as well most of the time. So you do have an audio interface in there, but most people don't think of that as an audio interface because it's not actually a separate device that's connected to your computer. But if you want to record a band, you can't just use the microphone jack on your computer. You need everything. You need an audio interface with enough microphone inputs or enough inputs if you're using a mixer. And that brings us to our next point down here. The audio interface is the main constraint regarding how many tracks you can record simultaneously. If I have a mixer that has, if I want to record, let's say I want to record 8 channels at the same time, I need to have an audio interface that has 8 inputs. And when you're designing your studio, when you're kind of thinking about what kind of studio you want to build, what kind of equipment you want to buy, and we're going to talk about this, especially this week, we're going to be talking about this and looking at the internet and stuff like that. But when you're thinking about what do you want to get for your studio, one of your big questions you have to ask yourself is, what do I want to record? How many instruments do I want to record? How many microphones, how many inputs do I need to record at the same time? If the answer is, well, mostly I'm just going to record vocals, so you'll only need one input. So your audio interface can be very small. It can just have like 2 inputs or 1 microphone input or something like that. It doesn't need to be super, super fancy. But if you want to record a band, and let's say you want to record 8 or 10 inputs at the same time because you're recording a band with all the drums and guitars, bass, vocals, all that stuff, then you need to have an audio interface that has more inputs, and those become more expensive. Now, one of the things I recommend when we're thinking about our audio interface, and again, we'll talk about this later, but one of the main things I recommend is to think about exactly what might you want to be doing a year from now or 2 years from now, and prepare accordingly. Because you can spend, $500 or $600 on a 2-channel interface. You can also spend $150 on a 2-channel interface, but the quality is not going to be as high. So if you think that a year from now you want to be recording a band, my advice is save your money a little bit longer and buy the right audio interface now. Spend $1,000 or $800 or something like that on a bigger audio interface that has all the inputs and outputs that you need a year down the road. Try to future-proof your studio a little bit. If this is something you think you're going to be doing. Now, if you're doing hip-hop or trap or house music, stuff like that, chances are you're not needing a lot of inputs unless you have some synthesizers. And even then, you might only have like 1 or 2 analog synthesizers or hardware synthesizers, so you don't need a ton of inputs and outputs. You just need the one main one. So, 2 or maybe 4. So, think about that and really be honest with yourself what you're going to be doing there, because it's going to help you in the future to save a little bit of money. Next one down here we've got is the Adac, Elisa's digital audio tape. And this is an 8-channel digital recorder that was really big in the 90s into the 2000s. It kind of looked like a VHS cassette. The main reason why we talk about the Adac is not because of the recorder itself, although it's useful, I guess, for field recordings and stuff like that. Although computers are so powerful nowadays, you don't really need to worry about this. But why it's really important is to talk about the cable that Elisa's made to go with it. That the Adac cable is an 8-channel digital audio cable that we still use today. Some people call it light pipe. And it's the one we did talk about it last week when we were talking about our cable types. It's the one that looks kind of like a little house. It's an optical cable. It's got like a little red light in it that sends the signal through using light waves. And so it can do 8 channels at the same time, which is pretty darn cool. And that's really why we talk about Adac still. We don't really talk about the recorder so much, although we do have an Adac recorder at SAE. We don't really use it that much. And then we've got the Multitrack tape machine, and that's a tape, audio tape, and there's 2 versions of it, the 24-track and the 2-track. The 2-track, I've got it underlined here because the 2-track is what you probably will see mostly for mastering and doing final recordings and stuff like that. People still do like to go to tape because it does sound really nice, and 2-track machines still are around a lot, and you'll see them quite a bit. So one of the things with tape machines, just to keep in mind, is they are expensive to repair. And then tape is also expensive and it's hard to get. So it's not the type of thing that you're going to see all the time. Even in bigger studios, there might be a 24-track tape machine, but really people record into Pro Tools these days. All right, so let's go back and talk about this input path a little bit more. So this is all the stuff, and you need to memorize this. This is important to memorize, and we're going to be having some, I'm going to be talking about this stuff with y'all during the week and over the next few weeks. And we're going to be keeping this going even when we're talking about Pro Tools or Ableton Live, Logic, the O2R, the SSL. Basically, this is going to be with you for the rest of your audio career. And it's really important that you kind of learn this now. I really implore you to please memorize this. So we start with the source. The source can be a vocal, it can be a guitar, or whatever. The source is transmitted into the microphone or the DI, and the DI is the box we talked about last week, or the microphone, and it's transmitted through the air or through a cable, something like that. This microphone is patched with a cable into the mic pre-input. Now the mic pre-input can be directly on the back of your console, or it can be a separate box that's separate from your console. And we'll talk about that more another time. And then this is assigned to the right channel, and that's usually assigned by plugging it into the back of the console. Or if you're on the O2R, you can go into a menu and assign stuff in there. The channel is what we have where we have our fader, our EQs. If there's a compressor, we'll have that there as well. And that's going to be routed with the group out or the direct out, depending on which board you're on. It's going to be a different thing. It's going to be called a different thing. And that's patched into our multi-track recorder. So this group out or direct out, this is on the Audient, it's actually a little routing matrix. It's got some buttons that you have to push that sends it out to the correct output. That's actually pretty uncommon. It's even on like some of the bigger boards, what you will see more likely is a direct out. The O2R has a direct out. I have an Allen and Heath Mix Wizard at home that's got a direct out. And really what the direct out, the difference between the group out and the direct out, the group out allows you to assign the output. So you can come into channel 1, but you could go out of channel 5. So it doesn't have to be tied into the same number that you're coming into. That's really up to you how you have these things assigned. But with a direct out, the direct out is everything is going just straight out of the one that it came into. So for example, the direct out, if I come into channel 1, that channel 1 is just going to go straight out of channel 1 again. And if I come into channel 2, it's going to go straight out of channel 2. Whereas with the group out, you'd have a routing matrix or something like that. So if I come into channel 1, I could assign it to go out of channel 5. Or if I come into channel 2, I could assign it to go out of channel 13, something like that. Now, even when you have group outs, if you don't need to assign it to something different, I recommend that you don't assign it to something different. Just keep it all what we call one-to-one. Keep everything going one-to-one. So if I come into channel 1, go out of channel 1. If I come into channel 2, go out of channel 2. If I come into channel 3, go out of channel 3. And that's really what I recommend to do. So different boards have a different way to go out, the direct out or the group out, and that is patched with a cable into the multi-track recorder. So let's go through this one more time. The source is transmitted to the microphone or DI, which is patched into the pre-input, and that's assigned to the channel, which is routed to our group out or direct out, which is patched into our multi-track recorder. Now the multi-track recorder is the hub of everything. That's where we're recording everything in, all the individual channels, and that's going to go out to our monitor path, which is what we're going to listen to. Because you noticed on here, there's no speakers in here. I don't have any speakers in this diagram here. So what we've got here is we start with the multi-track recorder. We're starting where we finished before. That is patched back into the line or tape in on the back of the mixing console. Basically, this is the same thing. It's a line in or a tape in, depending on your console. It might be slightly different. It might be one or the other. But basically, this is the same purpose, line or tape in, which is assigned to the channel. Again, like over here, we had a mic pre-input. Well, on this one here, we've got a line or tape input that goes into our channel. that's routed to the left-right mix bus. In this case, we're not using a routing matrix anymore to go to a different output or direct out. Everything is going into a stereo left-right mix bus. Some boards call this the stereo mix bus. Some boards call it the left-right mix bus. Some boards call it the master mix bus. It really depends. So Ty says, why would you need to assign it to a different out? Over here, when we're talking about the group out or direct out, assigning a signal to a different output, the only time you'd really need to assign it to a different output is if you already have something going to that input on like Pro Tools or whatever. So it's not super common that you would need to do it. It's just extra level of flexibility. So for example, if I already have something going into channel 1 on Pro Tools for some reason, so I can't use channel 1, but I bring something into channel 1 on my console, then I would say, okay, well, I can't go into channel 1. Channel 1's already being used. So let me go into channel 2. So I would go into my routing matrix and I'd push channel 2 on the routing matrix, and that would send the signal to the input number 2 on my Pro Tools. So that's why you would assign it to a different output if you just need to, if something's already being used. There might be other reasons if you're doing like a sound installation or something like that. Like these boards can be used for more than just recording. We're talking about them in terms of recording. But remember, there are all sorts of reasons for doing sound or audio. So if you were doing like a sound installation and you had channels 1 and 2, outputs 1 and 2 going to speakers over here, stereo speakers over here, and outputs 3 and 4 going to speakers over here, and outputs 5 and 6 going to speakers over here, and 7 and 8 going over here. So then you'd have different things going to different outputs, which you'd need to use a routing matrix to do that. And you could use it for that. But that's not super common. You might find stuff like that in a big concert hall or something like that. So if you do end up doing live sound, you'd use them more for this kind of stuff. But also you could use them for, you'd probably use the group outs on the like the buses for stuff as well. But you could assign things to, if you're working with musicians on a stage, you could assign it for that. But generally with stage productions, if we're big enough to have a giant mixing console, you probably actually have 2 separate consoles. You have one for the front of house, which is what the audience listens to, and you have a different one for the musicians, for what's going on stage, which would be our monitor mix. So really, if we're getting into a situation where you have that big of a board where you have a group out routing matrix happening, then more likely you're going to have actually 2 separate consoles to deal with the stage and the front of house. So it might be a slightly different situation. All right. So let's go back over here to our monitor path. We start with the multitrack recorder, gets patched into the line in or tape in. It's assigned to the channel, routed to the left-right mix bus. Now routed, in this case, instead of, we had routed over here, and this is our whole routing matrix. Over here, it's just going to be one button that says mix. That's it. It's just the one button, mix. And that mix button, that means that it's going to assign it to the left-right mix bus, which is what we listen to. Now the left-right mix bus can be controlled by a volume knob. It's usually a knob, it's not usually a fader. And then that is going to be hardwired into our speakers, and that's what we're listening to. So we're eventually going to get the audio to come out of our speakers so we can listen to it. But you notice this is 2 separate pages, but it's all part of the same overall signal flow. On the input path, everything is flowing into the multitrack recorder, and on the monitor path, everything is flowing out of the multitrack recorder. So everything's going out eventually to our speakers, to our ears. And here, we're going from our source, our voice, into the multitrack recorder. So just keep that in mind. This one here, the destination is ultimately our recording, and this one, the destination is ultimately our speakers. Cool. So let's take a look at let's pull it up right here. This is the Audient. Now, like I said, this one's a little bit grainy, but this is what we're looking at at school. This is what it looks like here. Over here on the left-hand side is our channels, and there's 24 channels. And then here in the middle is actually a remote control section for our DAW. This goes for our Pro Tools or whatever. It's our remote control section. We don't really talk about this one too much in Mod 2. You will be talking about it a little bit in Mod 3, just to learn how to do control of Pro Tools. But we don't really get into this too much in Mod 2. Over here is our master section, and the master section has two parts. It's got the top part up here and the bottom part down here. And I've got little breakouts of these, but before we talk about that, over here is our patch bay, and the patch bay is this big area right here, and this has plugs for all the inputs and the outputs on the back of this thing. Across the top up here is our meter section. We have our meters here so you can see the levels of each channel going up and down. And then on here you've got Auxes, and you've got EQs, and this one doesn't have any compressors on each channel, but then you get your faders here. And you can see across the top right here, there's one line right here. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can see this right here across the top. This is the short fader and the long fader. And if we go back to this picture here, on the Audient, the short fader is our input path, our input fader here, and the long fader is our monitor path. And you can see I've got them, this one's a little bit shorter than this one, although it's not too much. So the input path is our short fader and the monitor path is our long fader. And if we go look at the master section, wait, where are we? Let's find it on my, here we go. Oh, here, we can just use this one. There we go. This is what the master section would look like on the console, and this is just a picture I took at school, actually. So you have all these different sections here of the master section, which we're going to talk about in just a bit. But before we do that, let's talk about our channels, each channel. Now, the Audient does have the manual, and the manual is, where's our PDF? Manual. Here we go, the manual is right here. And if we look at the manual, it shows you, it starts off, it's got the signal flow of everything, shows you how the signal flow works of stuff and subgroups and all this stuff here, and it kind of gives you an explanation of how all this stuff works. And you can see what's going on here. Subgroups and all that stuff there for mixing and overdubbing, all these different ideas, and you really need to read this stuff. This stuff is very, very important. It talks about the metering, and we're gonna be talking about this, but I'm not gonna be reading from the manual talking about it. We're gonna be kind of paraphrasing and going through it. So really, it is part of the requirements for the course that you read the manual. Okay, this talks about various, like a glossary of different words. Again, you need to go through and read all these. We'll be talking about them. And I kind of expect you to just kind of know these. We will talk about them in different parts, but here they are. So please go through these. Now, in this section here, this is what we have in our notes. If I go over here to our notes, right here. And the notes, I've got them actually blanked out because one of the things you're going to be doing today is you're going to be going through and you're going to be labeling all this stuff using the manual to go through and label it so you learn it more effectively. Okay, but we're going to go through it right now, and let's go through it using the manual here. Okay, so number one here is the long meter, and number two is the short meter. They call it the 20 segment meter and the 3 segment meter. Basically, this here is we've got here the tape path or the input path. So let's just take a look at that and talk about what that means. And I want to show you something here with the colors that we've got going on here. On the Audient, one of the cool things about the Audient is how it's color coded. And again, I recommend that you try to memorize this, remember it. But basically, anything that's got a light gray background is your monitor path. And anything that has a dark background is the input path. So the input path is always the dark background, the lighter, and the monitor path is always the lighter background. And that will kind of help you to remember stuff. Now in here, we've got the monitor path is up here and the input path is here. These can be flipped though, because when you're monitoring, you want to see more meters. You want to have more visual cues about what's going on when you're getting your input path going on. I said monitoring. Sorry, I meant when you're level checking. And down here we've got a meter button. Now this one says MTR, and I know in the notes previously I just said Multitrack Recorder is MTR. The Audient is the exception. MTR in most worlds is the meter, is the Multitrack Recorder. In here it stands for meter. And what it does, this button here, if we look down here, the meter, press to show the mic line input on the large meter and the tape input on the small meter. So by default, the monitor path is on this long meter and the input path is on the short meter, but it's not useful for when we're level checking. So we want to be able to see our microphone input on this longer meter. So you push that meter button, number 6 there, and then we can see it going on right here. Okay. So in the beginning, always push this button and you can see what's happening on this longer meter, which will make your life a lot easier. Let me go down here. Let's skip this part right here. Let's go to this part down here. And we've got our input gain right here, our gain control for our microphone or our line input. This button here, this line button here, flips between the input path, flips between the mic path and the line path. Now, on the back of the Audient, there's actually 2 inputs. There's the input for the microphone and the input for the line, and you can flip back and forth between them using this button. The O2R is slightly different than this, and that the O2R works more like your Mackie. And the Mackie, remember, when you plug into it, it just takes over. If you have a microphone plugged in, you plug something into the line input takes over from the microphone. This is not like that. You can have 2 things plugged in at the same time, and the line input that you just flip between them with the button here. Then we have an insert input, and you get that on both the input path and the monitor path, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But then we've got here our gain knob, and the gain knob adjusts the gain, makes it louder if you need more input on that microphone level. Then we've got here our 48 volts. That's for our phantom power. If you have a condenser microphone, you need to have that. Then we've got our phase reversal here. You can flip the phase. And then we've got here our low cut here. Then that low cut just like cuts off the low end a little bit there. So that's all we've got going on here on our input path here. And on the monitor path, we've got an insert button, and then we have here number 4 here, which is just the trim control. And the trim control is not the same as a gain. The gain is actually a preamp, and that can add noise into the signal. The trim control is just a leveled out trim, and it can let more of the signal through or less of the signal through, but it's not actually gaining it. It's not actually adding signal to it, so you don't have to worry about it adding noise or anything to your signal. All right. Now over here's this part here. Let me just point out where we are right now. What we were just talking about was all the stuff up here across the top right here. Now what we're talking about is actually this section right here. This whole part right across the top part of the main plate of the board right here. Okay, and that's what we're looking at right now. So right here is our routing matrix. The routing matrix selects the group of outputs that the short fader signal is sent to. The first 8 switches also route to the 8 subgroups. So if we look at this, all of these 12 buttons here, they go to an output. Now remember, the Audient 8024 is a 24, it's got 24 channels on it. Those 24 channels, we can route to any one of them. Any input can go to any one of those sub outputs, those group outs. So that's where we're going to do it, is right here. So you got channels 1 through 12, and then if you push the shift button, you're going to go to 13 through 24. Then you've also got your pan button here, left and right, and then you've got this LF button. The LF button is the long fader button. LF, where is it? Right here. Yep. Replaces the short fader signal being sent to the routing switches with a signal from the long fader signal path. Basically what this does is, if you want to use this as buses when you're monitoring, or if you're mixing a live show or something like that, and you wanted to send your signals to one of the 8 buses, you can push the LF button and it can go from the monitor path to this routing matrix here, which would be useful for sending it to the buses. It's not something you're going to use a whole lot. We are going to talk about it because it's really useful, because talking about subgrouping and all that stuff, we're going to come back to this and talk about it more. I kind of want to take a moment just to stop for a second and just say, if you're like super lost, please just bear with me, because it will become more obvious as you work with the board. It's a lot of information right now. I know it's a lot of information. I get it, but just bear with me and you'll start to see what it all means. It might take a little bit. It might take like a week or two, but we have time. Don't feel like you need to understand everything right now. If you've never seen any of this stuff before, it's gonna be a lot. So please just take a breath and just try to absorb. And once you get in the room, we'll be there to help you to make sense of it all, okay? And it'll take a little bit to make sense of it, but you'll get there. I promise, you'll get there. All right. I would say I've never had anybody who's still confused by the end of Mod 2 who actually goes in and tries it. I've had people who don't really try that hard and they're still confused, but anybody who tries, who works hard to get this, they get it. Everybody does. It's not really rocket science. I know it feels like rocket science, but it's not exactly rocket science. All right. So then we have Aux Sends. Now, Aux Sends is stuff that you learned about in Mod 1. It's sending our signal to a separate output on the console, and this is for things like reverbs and delays, effects, stuff like that. You can also use your Aux Sends for a headphone mix, but the Audient is interesting in that it has a thing for the headphone mix down here in number 9. We can see down here A and B. This is our foldback section here, and the foldback section, they call it the foldback section, but really it's just for our headphone mix. It's dedicated to the headphone mix. So up here, Auxes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and you can see here it says auxiliaries 3, 4, 5, 6 are omitted for clarity, but are the same as Auxes 1 and 2. There's actually 6 aux knobs on here for the Aux Sends. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They just kind of got rid of 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 just to conserve space. So this is your send amount for each of your Auxes. By default, we can see the background is light gray. So by default, what that means is that each one is coming from our monitor path. But we can change it to come from the input path if we wanted to, for like a headphone mix or something like that, by pushing the short fader button. Here's our pre-fader button, and we're going to talk about what pre-fader means another time. And then we have here a button that says 7 and 8. Now, the thing is, this Audient actually has 12 Aux Sends, but you can only use 6 per channel at a time. Now, that's a lot. If you've never done anything with this, you might not know if that's a lot or not, but take my word that that's a lot. 6 per channel is a lot, but there are 12 Aux Sends overall. All right. I just moved it. Hold on, let's see, where are we? Oh, right here. Okay, there we go. Cool. All right, and there's some notes in here as well that you can read about, and it kind of explains a little bit more about it here. But again, once we get in there, we start working with it, I think it'll be a little bit easier for you to really understand what is going on. All right, this is our EQ section. The EQ section, we're gonna go over it a little bit in more detail another time. But I do want to show you, where are we? In here. What we're talking about down here, see these like little red dots? I know it's hard to see. These red dots right here and this gray area, this is where we are right now. Now, just for clarification, the Aux Sends are above right here. And then down here is our short fader and our long fader down here, which we're about to get to in just a moment. The EQ section is right in here. So that's where we are. And there are 2 EQ sections, and each section has an input and in button, and like what they call an insert. button. So this says number 1, HFLF section. This places the HF, high frequency, low frequency equalizer in the circuit, and that's why it says in. The in button was very confusing for me at first. I didn't understand why it says in. But the reason why it says in is because it's putting it into the signal path. The EQ on this board, same as like an SSL, the board is designed to be very clean. So if you're not using the EQ, you don't have to have the EQ in the actual audio path. That's what the in button does. The in button puts it into the path, so then the EQ starts to actually work its magic. By default, the EQ is on the monitor path, and once again we have a short fader button here to put that EQ on the short fader, the input path, if you wanted to EQ the input path. And we'll talk about some pluses and minuses about EQing on the input path. Then we have the high frequency knob and the low frequency knob. This is our gain knob here, and over here there's a little button that chooses what frequency we're going to use. Now this is a shelf. Again, we're going to come back and talk about what it means to be a shelf. If you looked at the notes, which I hope you did, you will already know what I'm talking about with the shelf because it's in the notes. It's in the notes for another day, like tomorrow or the next day or something like that. If you haven't looked at the notes, you're going to be completely lost, and this is why it's really important that you look at the notes every weekend so that we're not completely lost, because this is actually talking about something which there's so many parts to this, it's kind of hard to where to start really. But also hopefully you did talk about EQs in Mod 1 and you still remember what you talked about. So these are shelf EQs, and the shelf EQ has a place where the shelf actually, where you put that frequency, and when the button is up it's at 10 kilohertz, when it's down it's at 18 kilohertz. And down here on the low frequency side, when it's up, it's at 50 hertz, and when it's down, it's at 100 hertz. So this low frequency knob, if I had the button up, then when I turn the knob, it's actually making gain adjustments at 50 hertz and below. When it's down, it's making gain adjustments at 100 hertz and below. Depending on what you're EQing, you would set this button up or down. And the same thing down here in the low section here, we have our input button, which inserts into the signal, the short fader button, which says it's going to be on the input path or the monitor path. Remember, by default, when it's up, it's on the monitor path. When you push it in, it goes to the input path. And then we have two sections here. These three knobs go together, and these three knobs go together, and you can see that they're color-coded, so it's kind of easy to see that they go together. Right here we have a gain knob, we have our frequency knob, and then we have our Q knob, which sets our bandwidth, how wide or narrow that EQ is going to be affecting things. This top one here is the mid-high, and this one here is the mid-low, and that's why this one's in kilohertz here with our frequencies, and this is why this one's in hertz with our frequencies. All right. So one of the things we will expect you to know how to do is if somebody said to you, hey, can you increase the gain at 1 kilohertz, 1K, then you would know how to do that. And you would put it like right about here, and then you would adjust this knob up like this. And we can see that this one here is hertz, this one here is frequency, and this one here is gain, because this one says kilohertz and this one says dB. dB is also always for gain. So please remember that dB is always for your gain knob. If it says dB on it, you're going to increase the gain or decrease the gain. So that's really important to kind of understand that there. Next we get to our short fader. And the short fader, again, now we're at this part of the board right here. Short fader. And the short fader has a few things attached to it. We've got up top, we've got our pan knob for the short fader, which you're not really going to touch very often. We've got our source, which can be the long fader or the short fader, or the long fader can be sent to the short fader here. That's a little bit confusing. We don't actually really go over this too much in class, just because this part here is really more advanced routing purposes. And now number one here shows if you're coming from the mic input or the tape input. If you're coming from your input path or your monitor path, by default it should always, I mean pretty much all the time, it should just say mic input there. And then down here we have our fader itself. Usually you're just going to leave that set to 0, the unity right here. And then we have our solo button and our cut button. The solo button makes it so you're just going to hear that one fader, and the cut button actually mutes that fader, so you're not going to hear that fader at all. Now we are getting to our long fader, and the long fader is, we can see the background is light gray, so that's our monitor path. In this one here, we can flip between the tape or the microphone input. By default, when it's up, it's going to be tape input. If you push it down, it'll be mic input. Again, you don't really need to flip these back and forth unless you can't reach the short fader for some reason, but I don't think anybody in our class falls in that category. I'm actually not, like, realistically, I don't know why you would flip these. I'm sure there's a reason. It's mostly just for so you can change it up so it has flexibility. Number 4 here is our pan knob. You will be using the pan knob on the long fader. That's really important. You will be using that pan knob on the long fader. And then we have here number 3, which is our mix button. This is what sends it to the mix. Now, if we go over here, you notice that this one over here, the short fader, also has a mix button. We can assign the short fader to the mix, and you will do that when you're doing your level setting procedure. When you're level setting, when you need to hear, before you start recording, you just need to hear and make sure if somebody's playing a trumpet, you need to make sure that that sounds like a trumpet, then that's when you're going to push that mix button, because you're going to push the mix button in order to hear it just for a minute. Okay, cool, it sounds like a trumpet, it sounds good, and then we can unpush the mix button, because really where we want to be listening to it is on the long fader. That's our monitor path, the mix button there. And number 5 here is our solo button, and then number 6 is the cut button. It's the same as the short fader and the long fader. This is our long fader. It's a fader, yay. Great. And that's all there is really to say about the long fader. This has like more of a definition, explanation about it, but whatever, you can read that on your own. Cool, let's look at the back of the Audient here for a minute. The back of the Audient, and I don't have any kind of like big picture of this, but what we've got here is the microphone input, the line input over here, and then you've got your inserts here. And over here on the left is the tape input. And you'll remember lighter colors equal input path and darker colors lighter colors equal monitor path and darker colors equal input path. In this case here, it is like that. The lighter color here is our tape over here. It's our input, our monitor path here. Tape in, and then send returns, which is for our insert effects. And over here, this is a darker color. Even though it's not really dark, it's darker than over here. And this is our monitor path, our input path. The colors are the same, and so it's like confusing me a little bit. But this is our darker color, and so this here is our input path microphone, and this is what would go to the preamp. And then our line, which would bypass the internal preamp. And then our inserts here. And the inserts are for sending to insert effects like compressors and EQs, if you want to use some external compressors and external EQs and stuff like that. So that's all what's going on right here. Okay, there's not a whole lot. I mean, there's not a whole lot to show on the back of this thing. That's pretty much it right there. Let's just go over here and check out these notes. Make sure we're good here. Okay, cool. All right. Yep, cool. All right, so now we're going to talk about the studio speakers and the fold back section a little bit. Now, this here is the output for your studio, and we can see up here it says studio, and then down here it says speakers and fold back. The speakers are for if your studio has speakers in them, and the fold back is for the headphones. Now, the studio is where your musicians are, and the control room is where you live. So you got the control room, which is where you're going to spend most of your life as the audio engineer, and then the studio is where your musicians are going to spend their lives. And some studios have a speaker system in the studio. The reason why is because sometimes you want to listen to it without headphones on, and that's how you do that. So if you have speakers in your studio, then you can do that. But most, like, I can't think of really a lot of studios where I've been to where the actual recording room has a speaker system set up in it. Usually the musicians just come back into the control room and listen. But there it is. It's there if you need it. And over here is the foldback section. Now, foldback is just a fancy room for headphone mix. That's really all it is. It's just a fancy name for headphone mix. Just think of it like that. Foldback just means headphone mix. I wish they just said headphone mix instead of foldback section. There might be a reason why it's called foldback section. Maybe those words mean something to somebody. To me, it just means headphone mix. Now, you'll notice that down here, all these are the same for both of these sections, the speakers and the foldback. This here selects your source, and this selects your, well, this is the destination here. So this is you selecting your source for each one. So tape 1, tape 2, pretty much you can ignore those for the beginning part of things until you're starting to do your own recordings, your bounces and stuff like that. You don't need to worry about tape 1 and tape 2. What you would use mostly is your control room or your Aux A and Aux B. Now, let's just go back over here to this one here. And this one here shows us our Aux section. And here we've got an A and a B. If you're making a headphone mix, so each musician has their own mix of levels in their headphones, we have two dedicated knobs, but then you can actually use all your aux channels for headphones as well. But here we've got two dedicated ones, which is unique to the Audient, and we have A and B down here. And that A and B, what that ties into is this right here, Aux A and Aux B. And Aux A and foldback A and foldback B. It's the same thing. This A and this B are the same as this A and this B. So what does this mean? It means that if I've got A, that's one headphone mix. And a headphone mix means like my vocalist wants to hear their music softer and their voice louder, and the guitar player wants to hear the guitar louder and the drums softer. So we can make a dedicated mix for that person using all the knobs on the board. So we'd say here A, we push Aux A. Now that means it's going to be a mono mix in their headphones, but that's okay for recording. They don't need a stereo mix in their headphones for recording. So for A over here, left and right, you push the Aux A button. Now you'll notice that tape 1, tape 2, and control room do not have left and right buttons. The reason why they don't have left and right buttons is because these are stereo by default. But these are mono by default. So if I have something going to Aux A, and I want it to be a mono signal because I'm doing Aux A and B separately, then I would have I'd have both my Aux A left and right buttons pressed. And over here for Aux B, I'd press both my left and right buttons for Aux B. Really, the way you want to set this up is A has the A buttons pressed and B has the B buttons pressed. That's how you want to have that set up. Over here, you need the level turned up. I would usually turn that up to 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock to make sure you're getting a good level, or even more if you want to send them more signal. Depends on their headphone amp in the studio and what headphones they're using. And then you have the on button or the solo buttons if you want to solo it out. When you solo it out, you can hear that mix in your control room monitors as well. Now, again, I realize I'm saying a lot of words. I know I'm saying a lot of words. And if you did read the notes this weekend, then the words will mean something. But if you didn't read the notes, they're not going to mean as much. So if you're lost, it's okay. You will get unlost pretty quick. All right, now we have here our control room monitor source and section here. And remember, the control room is where you live. Okay, so first of all, in the control room, we have our source. What is the source of the control room? We have some different buttons here. The mix button, tape 1, tape 2, tape 3. 90% of the time, this is going to be mix button pressed. Your mix button is going to be pressed. So you're going to press that mix button, and that's your source select. And then you've got tape 1, tape 2, and tape 3. If you have bounced it to, you're done with your mix and you bounce it out, then you might be listening to tape 1, tape 2, tape 3 for monitoring those tapes. But like I said, 90% or more of the time you're going to listen on the mix. Now here's your output section for your speakers. Which speakers are you going to listen to on? Main, Alt 1, Alt 2, or Alt 3. Now you'll notice these all have knobs above them, but the main one does not have a knob above it. That's because the level for the main is right here. And let me just clarify real quick what we're looking at here. We're looking at the master section. I'm sorry, I wasn't very clear about that before. We are now looking at the master section here. Number 4 was the section we were just looking at. Where is it? Right here. I'm going to put this over here on this side. I'm going to keep this one on this side. There we go. So this here is this right over here. That's what we're actually looking at. You'll notice the coloring's a little bit off, but it's basically the same stuff. Now what we're looking at, this control room section, is this part right here. And this main button here doesn't have a knob above it because it's this knob right here. It's kind of buried under number 6 here. It's this knob right here. And this is where you're actually going to control your level in your control room. The left-right mix fader is number 10 down here. Number 10 is our left-right mix fader. But we don't actually want to touch that. We just want to put it all the way up to unity, all the way up, and then leave it there. And if it's too loud or too soft in the control room, you want to turn it down using this knob right here. So then we've got some other functions here. We got mono, we got cut left, cut right, we got cut overall, and dim right here. So that's all this stuff right here. Dim just turns it down. It's still, you can still hear it, but it just turns it down. Cut turns it off, mutes. And then you can cut your signal for your left side or your right side, and you can check it out to make sure what's happening. Or you can mono sum it, and then mono summing is for what? It's for, anybody know? Are y'all still there? Mono summing would be to check for your phase cancellation, to make sure everything sounds good between the two sides, left and right. You gotta mono sum that to check your phase cancellation. All right. Over here's our oscillator section. We're not really going to talk about this too much. We will talk about the solo section down here. The oscillator section is just a tone that goes through your speakers. You can just check your speakers at different tones, and you can put into a bus or the mix bus different frequencies, level, on or off. It just boo, just literally a tone, and it's just to check stuff out, just to make sure everything's good. All right, and then solo down here is for the solo buttons. We got the solo buttons going across the bottom of each channel. If you want to solo the button, well, this number 5 here is your level control. How loud is your solo button? And then also number 6 is solo in front. Now solo in front is basically a mix between, it's like a ratio between your mix and your solo level. This is actually a really cool feature that I've never seen in a board before, but it's like solo, usually when you push the solo button, what it usually does is it just solos that out completely and everything else just goes away and becomes silent. But the Audient has a feature where you can actually mix between your overall mix and your soloed out instrument, so you can hear the mix behind it in the background, and you can adjust this level, how much of it you're hearing. So all the way to the left is just completely soloed. You're not hearing any of the instruments. And then if you put it like in the middle, it's going to be half and half. So you really want to mess with it until you get a comfortable setting here. And solo in place switches the console into solo in place mode. This means that the solo signal will replace the mix signal at the stereo output of the console. So if you are recording a 2-track, you want to make sure that solo in place is not pressed. You do not want to have solo in place pressed, because what would happen if solo in place is pressed, it means that if you were to solo something out, it would actually it would solo it to the master fader as well. So it's really up to you how you want to have that set up when you're monitoring. But if you want to use those solo buttons, you really have to have that on. But if you are going out to a 2-track or something, you have to be careful about that. And then number 8 selects either pre-fader level or after fader level. This switch is not affected. So post or pre, basically. And that talks about it. It kind of explains it more over here. So we could talk about that more another time, but I encourage you to read about this first and kind of like take a minute to kind of digest it before we start talking about it more, because that gets complicated. All right, then we have a compressor. Where we're looking at right now is right over here. The one we were just looking at is this section right over here. And what we're looking at right now is the bus compressor, which is right here. The bus compressor is a compressor on the out bus of the whole board. That's on our master fader, basically. And here we have normal compressor functionality. We have the threshold, we have the ratio, we have our attack, we have our release, and we have our makeup gain right here. And these little LED lights are your gain reduction, how much gain reduction it's applying. So that's all this right here. And then the in button just turns it on or off, puts it into the signal or out of the signal. That's up to you if you want to use it or not. I recommend, if you are going to use it, to go sparingly on it, because the last thing you want to do is overcompress your output signal. That would be not super, super fun. All right. And again, this just kind of talks about why you might use that compressor. You know, something like that. It talks a little bit about compression and what you might use it for. And again, that's something we can talk about in class. That's like a Zoom conversation. All right, next we're going to move up here to this section right up here. This is our stereo inputs. There are 4 stereo inputs on the Audient, and what these are used for is really up to you. The stereo inputs are basically like limited channel inputs. The channel inputs all have EQs and stuff on them. The stereo inputs do not have EQs on them. They're just an input for a stereo signal. And this is, I think it talks a little bit about it over here. They allow the signals to be brought back into the console from an effect unit without using up a complete channel strip. Often stereo signals can only be routed to the stereo mix. However, on the 8024, stereo inputs allow routing back to the multitrack in addition to the mix. This means that effects can be recorded on the multitrack. You can also use stereo inputs for things like a CD player or an MP3 player, something like that. If you have a studio, is the compressor similar to like a stock plugin? The compressor is, I guess it's similar to a stock plugin. It's a bus compressor. I would say the plugins are more similar to a compressor, to the compressor in this case, but it's just a compressor that's on the main output of your console. It's like on the master fader. If you have a master fader in a Pro Tools setup, this compressor would be on that master fader. Okay, the stereo inputs here. If somebody comes over and they say, hey, I want to play a beat for you, just real quick, you might have a cable connected up to one of your stereo inputs that they can just plug into. So they just have like an 1/8 inch jack coming out of the back, and they can just plug into it, you turn it up, and you go. And that's what a lot of studios will have set up for these stereo inputs. And you would also have effects routed back into it. So there's 4 of them, so you've got 4 stereo inputs here. So that's a total of 8 channels. You've got a little mix button here, you've got a solo button, a cut button, all those same things. You've got a gain button, which is basically like your trim knob. And you've got your routing matrix here. If you want to record whatever's coming into that stereo input, you can record it right here. And you've got channels 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice how they're doubled up, they're paired up. That's because everything is a stereo input, so you don't have a way to make it mono. You also have foldback A and B. You can actually send it to your headphone mix for your for the studio, for the players. I'm going to move on from this, but we will come back. We're going to be talking about the stereo input quite a bit, actually, when we're talking about reverbs and stuff. All right, and finally, down here across the bottom, we have our subgroups. There are 8 subgroups, and then each one has a pan knob, a mix button, and a solo or cut button. Now, if you want to have these set up for stereo mixes, there's 8 of them, right? So you can have 4 stereo mixes. What you do is, for number 1, you'd press the mix button and pan it hard left, and number 2, press the mix button and pan it hard right. And that's going to have it set stereo left and right. 1 is going to be left, 2 is going to be right. And then you've got a fader knob for each one there. Cool. All right, and this just talks a little bit about subgroup outputs, and this talks about the subgroup faders. And again, we'll talk about these in more detail, and I'll show you how to do all this stuff. All right, and then we have our talkback section. The talkback section here is, there's your level right there, and then you've got the Slate, SLS, and FB. FB lets you talk to the foldback outputs. The Slate lets you talk to the group outputs, and then you can like do 1, 2, 3, 4, like you can record track information stuff. And the SLS lets you talk to the studio loudspeakers. You don't need to use these buttons here. You need to use this button on the right. Our button at SAE has been used so much and so many different grubby little hands on it that that it's actually faded off. It doesn't have any, it's just a white button now. It doesn't have any text on it. So just know that that's the button that you use, the one on the right hand side. Yeah. All right. And then we have our Aux Masters. We're looking at this part right up here, number 3. The Aux Masters here, each one of these has a knob, and if you learned about the Mackey's 1604 at school in Mod 1, it's the same thing. Remember, your Auxes always have a master out. So the Auxes are all the way back here in the beginning, we talked about early on, right here, these here. And you notice how there's a level right here for like number 1, for example. Well, I have to have that level turned up there, but then I also have to have the level turned up over here, number 1, right here, this first blue one or green or whatever color that is. I have to have that level, that one turned up as well. And I usually just turn these up to like 12 or 1 o'clock and just kind of let it go. You can turn it up more if you want or less. It really depends. But that's a master output. And so everything that's going to Aux 1 would go through this one eventually. So if you have a lot of stuff going to Aux 1 and you're clipping the input of your reverb, for example, you can just turn down the Aux Master and it's going to give you a little bit less heat on the input. Okay, these 2 red ones here are for your foldback level. You got to have those turned up for your headphone mix as well. There's a lot of things to turn up and there's a lot of like little small things to keep in mind. You will forget some of them at some point. That's why it's so important to have my notes in your iPad with you in the room. If you go into the room, I do require you to take your notes in there because you will need them. And I'm going to be asking you, we're going to be talking about it. Hey, do you have your notes? Hey, do you have your notes? Make sure you bring your notes. Make sure you bring your iPad to school. Make sure you bring your phone to school. That kind of stuff there. So that's super, super important. All right, and then you've got your bus master trims, which this console does not have the bus masters. Well, I guess unless it's talking about these over here. This is just your overall. Yeah, this okay. So this is your routing matrix outputs, and you just want to leave these at 12 o'clock here. That's number 2 up here. Just going to leave those at 12 o'clock. You're not going to touch them unless you're clipping for some reason. But if you're clipping, something else weird is kind of happening probably. And then you've got your master fader that's down here on the bottom. This is the final stage before you're recording. And that's really important. Just basically, you're going to put it up to 0 and then that's fully open and just leave it there. Okay, and if you put it number 3, that's the signal is closed and no audio is going to pass through. All right, and all the rest of the manual here, this part over here just talks about inserts and outputs and stuff like that, and that talks about the back of the board. And then it also goes into a really good description about your patch bay, and which we'll be talking about the patch bay later on. All right, and we're going to stop there. Now, I will say, we're going to stop. Hold on, let me just stop the recording here.